going to turn it over at this point to Joanna. Thanks.
Hi, okay, welcome everyone. And I want to just thank the Hub members for inviting me to share with you all this evening. And thank you, Rita, for that opening. So I just want to share with you all, my voice is recovering from COVID. So there might be times you're going to hear me clearing my throat. Okay, and so, so a little bit about me and my experience. My background is social work, and I've worked in many areas of social work, but where I have really landed on is palliative care. And also grief and loss are areas that I really like to talk about, as well as healing, using Indigenous healing models. I'm also a mom. That's an illustration of me and my daughters. And for me, I've got a lot of reading and papers around me, but really I would like to spend more time with my poagin, my pipe that I'm holding in my hand here. And you know, my daughters are pretty busy girls too. And so a little bit about my background. I am Anishinaabe from Serpent River First Nation, where I live. And I also have French heritage through my father's side, and that's where you see the last name Vautour. But my family names here in Serpent River are Mowaski and Bazayan. And so have to do some disclosure here. I have been involved in developing a cultural safety module on grief and loss experienced by Indigenous peoples, and I give thanks to Holly for recommending me to do that work. And it was long and hard. And I am receiving some financial support and honorarium as a speaker this evening. So the learning objectives tonight is describe Indigenous communities' experience of grief and bereavement and the factors that impact the grieving process. And what I'm doing here is I know that a lot of us work in palliative care, have a lot of experience, you know, in bereavement care. And so, excuse me, I want to take things a little bit back just to kind of show the cumulative and delayed grief with Indigenous peoples, and then explore ways to support individuals and families experiencing grief given the unique contextual issues. I first want to begin in acknowledging that Indigenous peoples, you know, always had their traditional, you know, healing practices, you know, to help with grief and loss. And that in these, is that, you know, we always lived a holistic life, and holistic wellness was very much a part of that good life. And also we had ceremonies, we had the medicines, there was family and community. And, you know, this was all a part of, you know, the healing process. And thinking about, you know, grief and loss, we had all that knowledge. And the land is another place, you know, we talk about, you know, where we can receive healing. Even if we just, you know, go for a walk, or if we just, you know, sit out in the land, you know, maybe it's on that rock by that water, or maybe it's, you know, with that tree. And I myself, in supporting people in their grief process, I would probably say that being on the land is probably where I found most effective for people, you know, to feel safety and trust, you know, to be held by the land, and, you know, to give and let go, you know, that grief that they're carrying. So experience of bereavement. This image here, and I remember a couple of years ago, I ran into somebody, you know, I ran into someone, and we were talking about, you know, bereavement and some of those traditional practices. And I remembered them showing me this. And so this is a sacred Anishinaabe burial practice by communities. and it's a spirit house. And how it's described here is that it houses the spirit of that loved one until they make their journey into the afterlife. And so in this story here was a really interesting story in this news article. And what this article talked about, it was about a family in Dryden, and that they had did this traditional burial practice, for one of their loved ones. And what happened was, in that story, was that they were contacted, by that city, saying that it violated a bylaw, and that so what happened was there were some conversations, between that family and that city, talking about, this is our traditional practice. And so from that conversation, they were able to come to an agreement and to let that stay. But for that family, when they received that call, the brother of that person that is buried here, what he felt was that it renewed grief for him. It brought back the grief of that time. And so I thought that was really important, story to share. And that, I hope to see that, there'll be more communities learning about this practice and bringing it back. So the experience of grief, acknowledging the historical colonial wounds. So I know we focus a lot on the present and our relationship and working with, that family, that patient and family in palliative care. But here, I want to take things back at the time of contact. And this is where grief had started with Indigenous peoples. So starting with the 1400s and the doctrine of discovery. And what that meant was that it meant that, those newcomers coming to the land, that they can claim the land as their own. And that the original peoples, the Indigenous peoples, weren't seen as people that could own the land. And so this doctrine of discovery is also being called back by a lot of activists for the Pope to rescind this policy here. But through that journey, and I feel like I'm going back to school when I was taking Indigenous studies, but the Royal Proclamation, this was signed by King, by one of the British kings, I can't remember his name, but he basically gave recognition recognition of title to Indigenous communities and providing guidelines for negotiating treaties on nation-to-nation basis. So for me, I always see a signing of it. I'm going to say signing and doing those air quotes of treaties, because I don't think those treaties were in good trust and with honesty. But I also believe that that is another traumatic event that happened in the timelines of Indigenous peoples here. The British North American Act, also known as the Constitution Act. And what this was that colonial responsibility for Indigenous peoples and lands was transferred to the federal government. So initially, it was, the Queen or the King, and that they gave it over control of Indigenous lands to the federal government. So this, here, you see the loss of the land and how important. We talk a lot about the importance of land. And last week, Elton talked about, all our relatives, all our relations, and that is a part of the land. The Indian Act, I'm going to go into a little bit more detail, but it's a consolidation of Indian policies. And for our Métis relatives, the Northwest Rebellion, this is another traumatic event, where they were resisting against the federal government. And we hear a lot about Inuit relocation and the harm that it did to Inuit people, moving them from their homelands to more northern climates where it was very harsh. And so this impacted their relationship with the land as well as the way they lived. The 60 scoop, we hear a lot about that, and the 60 scoop, and this refers to a period where Indigenous children were taken from their birth families and they were adopted out to non-Indigenous families. So the Indian Act, there's a lot of pieces of information here, but very important because the Indian Act really impacted the grieving process. So it began in the 1880 where farmers actually needed permits to sell cattle, to sell, their harvest, but also even to buy groceries. They needed a permit. So, and then in 1884, we hear a lot about residential schools. And so I don't want to go into that, but 1885, the ban on spiritual ceremonies. Okay, the ceremonies had our ways, to grieve. And so this here was a true act that basically disconnected us in the ability, to grieve all these losses that we were experiencing in the genocide, of Indigenous peoples. The Indian Act also defined who is an Indian, and it began in 1880 with the Indian Act, but in 1886, the definition was updated. So here we have people telling us who we are and who is an Indian. And so, and this was also a system that was centered around men, and that women, that they were not recognized, as being able to pass on their identity, to their children, but men were basically outlined being able to pass on their identity to their children. So also want to talk about 1914, permission to wear any costume and dancing was also outlawed off reserve. So costume, being seen, our traditional clothing being seen as costumes. Okay, is another great loss, for us as well, and that we weren't allowed to dance outside of the reserve. But later on, in 1925, dancing is outlawed, period. And so if you think about, what dancing brings to the people, dancing brings joy. We know that we have that healing dance of that jingle dress as well. But this was a very sacred practice to the people, as well as socially, and it was connection. In 1918, government also leased out Indigenous lands to non-Indigenous farmers. So again, another act, loss, to land, but very much a loss in autonomy and our ability to live our life in the way that, I'm going to say, Creator originally instructed us. In 1927, there was a ban from hiring lawyers or legal representation regarding land claims. And so, we knew with the government's control and transactions in giving land to others, we knew that this wasn't right, and that we had people who were fighting against this. In 1951, bans on dances, ceremonies, and land claims are removed, and women are allowed to vote in band council elections. So women traditionally had a voice in the way they lived their life and governance as well. And so you could see here that women did not have a say in what happened in their community. And 1960, Indigenous peoples were allowed to vote in federal elections. And so, and then, as you can see, these are several factors that impacted the grieving process of from the Indian Act. And what you saw, that it had a lot of control over Indigenous people's lives, and that we're very much, confined to a space and not allowed to pretty much live who we are, as Indigenous people. So in recognizing the colonial wounds and grief, what I would say colonization has caused a lot of trauma. And trauma refers to a person's reaction or response to an injury. And that, these traumatic events were experienced, by the individual, family, and at many community levels. And this reaction or response can be felt emotionally, mentally, physically, or spiritually. And one of my teachers, Jane Middleton Moss, what she says, where there is trauma, there is grief and there is loss. And so in looking at grief and loss experienced by Indigenous peoples, it's very complex because of the historical and intergenerational, multi-generational trauma. And so the impact of grief has affected the health and well-being of Indigenous peoples. So if you can recall, and if you've spent time learning the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action and the ones regarding health, one of them states, that acknowledging, the impact that residential schools has had on Indigenous people's health. So some of the types of losses, the land, access to resources, and also our sacred locations. From where I live in Serpent River First Nation, in the land that I live, if I were to drive about 30 minutes north here, in the town of Elliott Lake, that is built on many of their families from my community, their trap lines. And also, if we drove maybe about an hour north of here, is one of our sacred sites, is Thunderbird Mountain. And this is a place where a lot of ceremonies took place. So with that access to land, plant medicines, and food resources, we were gatherers, hunting, fishing, and harvesting. This was our way of life that sustained us. We moved our body a lot. And we also nurtured our body with natural foods. Our cultural identity, as you can see, was very much controlled by the Indian Act. And one of those impacts was the language. And we heard a lot about, residential schools was one of those forms to basically disconnect us, from the language. And so it was really great, to have Elton present last week and bring in that language and that knowledge. Family and community connections. We are social human beings, all of us, wherever direction that we come from. But with the family and community connections, it created belonging. And it created those connections. And so we know that through that, for example, residential schools, it really impacted the parenting and our parenting styles. And that important relationship, that grandparents and, parents had with their children. Some of our pieces of our knowledge was lost as well, because we weren't able to practice some of those traditions. And health and well-being. High rates of chronic illness that we see with many of our community members. And also recognizing that trauma is also another factor that has basically increased chronic illnesses. And so when we're not able to grieve, we know that can create an imbalance physically, spiritually, mentally, emotionally in our bodies, and can cause illness. Social economics, we were traders, hunting and the gathering was a part of how we sustained ourselves in through our communities. And then I want to talk about innocence, trust, and hope. This is a result of trauma. And if you look at all of those colonial wounds that were experienced, Indigenous peoples have lost their innocence. They've lost their ability to, some have lost the ability to trust, and also hope, hope for the future, that, things will change, and that, life, can be good. And so, in thinking about those losses, thinking about, when we meet some of those, community members that come into our healthcare spaces, that they still could be carrying some of these losses in their life. So grief experienced by Indigenous peoples, grief is complex. when thinking about those colonial wounds and also those direct wounds that some of those community members could be living with. And so grief incorporates multiple symptoms such as anger and sadness, and it can be varied by individual culture and time. Cumulative grief, we see this a lot in communities, and this can also be known as, delayed grief as well. So thinking about, our ancestors who went through that colonial trauma and not having the space and the time to grieve some of those losses, and then how that can impact, the future generations. And those residential school survivors, the ones who went to school, and I want to say the families have also survived, that experience as well. And that, thinking about, did they have the space and the time, to grieve that experience? And the collective grief, we've been seeing that collective grief across Turtle Island with the nations, where we saw, National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, also known as Orange Shirt Day, where people really take that day to acknowledge, that collective grief that we share, as a people from that historical cumulative trauma that is felt not just at the individual level, but as a family and community and nation. And so I think I got about 3 slides left. I hope I'm doing good for time. So ways to support families. Okay, these aren't the updated slides that I'm noticing. These aren't the slides I actually sent in that you guys are going to see. But what I want to share here about ways to support individuals and families, and if my memory serves me right, I think about not re-traumatizing patients and families, when they're coming into our space. So thinking about, that Indigenous family who might be carrying, some of that historical, trauma and grief, but also what they might have experienced in their lifeline, in their life walk, here on Mother Earth. And I think what else is very important is that we do not ask any intrusive questions. I think it's really about creating space for them on what is going to make them feel safe when they come into your space. And one of the things when I was navigating cancer services in Toronto, I'd get a lot of questions. Well, Joanna, how do we talk to patients and, Indigenous patients? And what I would say to them is that I remember one patient, what she said to me was, I liked the way the doctor spoke to me. I really liked the way the doctor looked at me. I liked the way the doctor explained things to me. I liked the way, the doctor listened to what I had to say. And I think that's how we're going to, create safety for those ones to be vulnerable with us, to feel a sense of trust that they can tell their story. And I think it's for us is to listen, don't ask questions, but just validate what they're sharing with us. Because we know that our stories were not validated. And I think that is really important that, patients and families are seen and heard.
Joanna, did you want me to share your slide deck?
Yeah, can you?
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I don't know what happened there. There we go. That looks a lot nicer. So I'm gonna shut this one down here. Okay. So is this where I should have been, eh? Okay. So ways to support individuals and families. So talking about the types of losses, the primary loss of someone or something, usually working in palliative care, we see the loss of, anticipated grief, Maybe they're preparing, in supporting that one as they're making that transition, to the spirit world or that Western doorway. But what are the secondary losses that come with it? And so that's the result of the primary loss. So I'm going to give an example for me. I'm a twin sister. I have a twin sister and I have twin daughters. And so my twin sister and I are very close. And so for me, she would be my primary loss. But the losses that come with that is my sisterhood, is my confidant, is the person that knows all of my stories, and that, who's going to be that person in my life that's always going to be there, that I can always trust and depend on. And she's also an auntie, to my daughters. She's like a second mom. And so, those would be all those secondary losses that I would be grieving. She's the person that I talk to every day. And to think about, not to have that, in my life. I've never thought of that. I'm getting emotional. But be aware of the stigmatized losses, the ones that are judged or labeled. So those stigmatized losses could be maybe somebody died from a violent death. Maybe it's a death where they say that could have been prevented. So for example, suicide. These are often ones that are judged and labeled, and that, the survivors of that loss could carry a lot of shame and guilt about that experience. Another stigmatized loss, our elder Rita, who did the opening, talked about ones living with addictions. When we see someone that we love struggling with so much pain that they're using addictions to cope in their life, we grieve the loss of that person, of how they were before they started using, drugs and alcohol to cope. So that's another example. Ambiguous losses. Someone mentioned earlier, supporting someone who had dementia. That's an ambiguous loss as well, and loss of what was. And so when looking at how we support individuals and families with grief and loss, depending on where they are at in the stage of their life, we are going to figure out what our approaches are. And so children are going to grieve, differently. Youth will, adults will, and elders. But I also want to mention, men and women as well are going to have a different way of grieving, but also thinking about those ones who don't identify with a gender and who identify as non-binary. Those two spirit folks, they have a unique life journey as well as being in two spirit, and they've also had their own grief and losses, of that belonging and acceptance, in community as well. And so when looking at grief and loss can be very complex. Next slide. Thank you, Holly. And so the Cree language, I love this quote. This was a quote from an elder, Mary Martha Joannis, and she's Cree. And she said that our language is honest and clear, and it is very soft, and it's a healing language. And so thinking about communicating with those patients and families, if you notice, a lot of us are very soft-spoken. And I think, coming in, I know some of us naturally might have a louder tone, and but if we can maybe, bring it down a little bit, I think that can create some comfortability and safety. And so having empathy, we want to also empower people. Let's not look at them as, not look at them with, pity, but look at them with resilience, and about who is this amazing person that is, here with me in this space and time. Kindness and caring, respect, these are values that are talked about, Indigenous people, with Indigenous peoples. We all know that paced work is really important. We know that, in talking about grief and loss, and when someone is in it, we don't want to force anyone to make any decisions. We also don't want to force anyone, to tell us what it is that, we think we need to know, at this moment. And so I'm going to go to the next slide. And so this is another quote that I'm sharing by another elder named Dorothy Keon. who's also a relative of mine. And what she shared was that in one of our education sessions with Holly, she said, we are relearning our ways to grieve. And, you know, sometimes you just hear quotes and they just stick with you, that you can remember them, and that there's a reason why, you know, that you can remember them. And relearning our ways to grieve, because there was a time that we weren't allowed to grieve. And there's a resurgence and a remembering of Indigenous knowledge and practices. And the grief process, as we know, is influenced by our past grief experiences and culture. But if you think about, you know, when someone's past grief experiences involves, you know, we don't talk, we don't feel, and we don't trust, right? And that's what they're going to learn to do in their life. But if they have that experience where that they're given space in safety and being guided on that grieving process, you know, that can change that pattern and how they see grief. And so we learn about grieving, you know, from our family and community. Often when I meet with individuals who are grieving, I like to ask them, what did you learn about grief from your family and community? Was there, can you tell me about, you know, when there was a significant loss, and how did your family respond? What were the things that you did to honor that person? And sometimes, you know, they might say, nobody talked about it. We didn't do anything. And so just exploring on where that comes from. And our knowledge is in our language, as we had learned, you know, from Elton last week. And the healing comes from the ceremonies and the land. And so this is my last slide, and just some reflections, you know, about grief and me and grief and us. And so I don't know if we'll have time to talk, but, you know, think, and maybe it's something you need to think about, but does witnessing others' grief impact me? And, you know, what types of grief have you encountered in your professional practice? And thinking about, you know, as we know, working in palliative care, we see it every day. Sometimes we know that there might be, when that we see that patient, you know, transition, we're okay with it. But I found that sometimes there were patients, you know, that it really hit me. And so thinking about, you know, your organization, what is done to support staff in their grief, and do you have check-ins and debriefing? And I had this wonderful, you know, colleague that every time a patient passed, she always made time for me in my calendar, and we sat in her office and we talked about that person and how it was an honor to be supporting them, you know, in that journey. And we also had the tissue box on that table. But thinking about our personal grief, you know, how do I integrate my grief journey into my professional practice? And for me, it's looking at my experiences with grief, and have I taken time to grieve them, but also what I've learned through the ceremonies and how I can bring that into my work. Next slide. And I want to thank you all for being patient with me and with my slides, but I believe the correct slides have been uploaded to the hub and you'll be able to see those. And for some reason, my voice got clear in the end. So I'm glad I was able to finish it off.
Miigwech, Joanna.
Mm-hmm.
Kevin.
Yes, thank you. I wish we had hours and hours tonight, as I did last week too. But I wonder if anyone has a question or two for Joanna, and then we're going to move on to the case.
I think we should just move to the case, Kevin. And
you think so? Okay.
Yeah, I think we're pushing it right now.
Okay, that's fine.
Elder Rita does have something to say, though, I think.
Oh, all right. Go ahead, Elder Rita.
Yes. Just from my own experience being under the Indian Act and everything, and growing up in we're in a Indian day school, the history wasn't taught to us, so you know I didn't know, and plus being told by my dad, you know, never cry. So it was a learned behavior. So then you know, it wasn't until my 30s when I started learning about the history that I was able to start my healing journey. So that's probably the case in many communities about not knowing about the history, because my mom and dad didn't have education. My mom said she went to book 3. So I don't know what that is back then, but and that's a big thing, is that the lack of history, and also being Christianized. Most of the northern communities are Christianized, and there's like 3-4 churches in the community. So like, you know, and the youth are lost because of that disconnection there between the parents, the elders, and the youth. That there's that disconnect. So, and the having no identity is a big part, was a big part in my growing up, no identity, because of the discrimination against Native women. So, you know, I think history plays a big part in that disconnect, and also the grief that has been held in, and so, and also compounded grief, you know, because there's so much happening. You don't have time to grieve your mother or your daughter or your, you know, your uncles. It's just one after the other. So it's compounded grief that never, I shouldn't say never, but it doesn't get dealt with. So you become numb after a while. So, you know, and that's a big issue too.
Thank you so much, Rita, you know, for sharing that. And I just want to note crying, and just encourage everyone to be comfortable with crying, whether it's you that you have to bring those tears, or if it's witnessing somebody else bring those tears. And let's let people cry, because think about all the times, like Rita had said, when you were told not to cry, or when you had to hold back those tears, you know, to even protect yourself because crying wasn't safe. And so as clinicians, let's be comfortable, you know, with crying.